Welcome to The Backstory, a program from the North Dakota News Cooperative that takes an in-depth look at the stories we're reporting for you. I'm Sabrina Halverson, CEO of the North Dakota News Cooperative. They traveled 2,500 miles by bicycle, following the migration of one of North America's rarest birds. A few weeks ago, the North Dakota News Cooperative reported on the journey while it was still underway. Now the ride from Texas to Canada is complete. So joining us on The Backstory today are conservation photographer Mike Forsberg and Andrew Caven of the International Crane Foundation. Mike, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself to us, tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Sure. I am Mike Forsberg, and I am a conservation photographer, and I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is where I've been born and raised. So I've worked in the Great Plains most of my life.
All right, Andy.
My name's Andy Caven. I'm an ecologist and director of the Central Flyway programs for the International Crane Foundation, which is based in Baraboo, Wisconsin, but it's a global organization. And we've been working on diving into the Central Flyway, given the challenges there. And I've known Mike for a long time. I met him when I worked at the Crane Trust as their director of conservation research.
All right, guys, tell us a little bit about how the idea for this ride got started.
We've been talking about ways to tell the story that engages people. And at this point, all Mike and I's answers to these things are shared. You know, I've learned from his answers, he's learned from mine. And I think the relatability of this trip was really important. And Mike's highlighted that over and over. So we're going to the lab. We're thinking of how do you tell the story of habitat loss in the Central Flyway in a way that engages people and gets them to actually care and see it from multiple levels, right? And we've been talking about some other ideas, but I think I really had this idea of a big trek, you know, because I think connecting recreation in a relatable way to conservation's really exciting, and I think doing big hard things is exciting and interesting to people. And so we thought this might draw some attention to some of the challenges in landscape conservation that we're not just facing for whooping cranes or at the International Crane Foundation, but we're facing as a community in conservation. You know, we've been working really hard at habitat stuff in the Central Flyway for a long time, and we've been still falling behind. So let's try something kind of crazy, especially in a hard environment for conservation at the moment, just in terms of, you know, policy and easements. And that's not just at the federal level, you know.
And this was a bike ride from Texas to Canada. So you covered a lot of ground. And this was the first time you've done this ride, is that right?
No.
Do you think there'll be another time?
No,
Not for me.
Okay.
No, but I'm glad we could say that we actually did it, because I think right out of the gate, the first couple of days, we were quite suspect about whether or not we had bitten off more than we could chew.
I can only imagine. I mean, it's quite the trek. And just the fact that you guys were able to do it, you set a goal, you finished it, and you learned a lot along the way. Now that you have completed the entire ride, what were some of the things that you learned that you think would be really important to know about the whooping crane migration?
Well, I think about the whooping crane migration, what we learned was maybe some of what we already knew, and that is that the whooping cranes need healthy wetlands, which are, if they're healthy wetlands, they should be surrounded by healthy grasslands. And we know the statistics already. We know the numbers, but these habitats continue to dwindle, and it doesn't show itself like shaving off a mountaintop or clear cutting a forest. It's in the Great Plains of North America. We continue to lose ground like watching a melting snowfield out there. It's almost imperceptible, but it continues to go away. And being able to experience that on your bike, where you're traveling literally every inch of 2,500-mile long migration corridor, using the whooping crane's story and their pathway as sort of the muse or the thread to pull us through. We saw that every minute of every day. So, and I'll say that, I have flown this pathway in a small plane in 2022. I flew 2,500 miles to look at it from an oblique view with a pilot friend of mine to see what whooping cranes see from the air. And I've spent 30 years working in the Great Plains. And so I've seen a lot of this stuff by driving in my steel and glass bubble to get to a place to then spend a bunch of time in the Missouri Coteau of North Dakota, that's for instance, or the Sandhills in Nebraska, but to be able to connect the dots and move as whooping cranes move every day. We would get up and we would first decide, can we pedal today? If we can, how far are we going to go? And where are we going to eat? Where are we going to get fuel? Where are we going to sleep? All of those things. And those are the same decisions that anything that migrates, including a whooping crane, need to make every day also. So we were almost like living their lives in a way through this idea of doing this under our own power.
Yeah, I mean, Mike said it really great, and we really learned in two facets, right? There was actually, collecting information on the Central Flyway and its condition, both experientially and scientifically, because we did collect data every day. And then on another side, there was the experience of trying to migrate, right? Feeling the weight of migration, experiencing it. And it was really about empathy and translation, right? Because like I don't think most people know what it's like to migrate like a bird, but when you go through the experience of trying to migrate, you have all those decisions like Mike just highlighted that you need to make. But you also develop a new empathy, like for instance, the smoothness of the roads was a big consideration. Well, that translated for me and Mike to, the currents in the air can be smooth or bumpy or everything else, so it was this deep experience of trying to understand what it was like to be in migration, feeling it, but trying to relate it to your individual personal experience. And then there's, like Mike said, was the habitat loss stuff and understanding the condition of the flyway. There's tons of research put out. We're losing Delaware per year, or Yellowstone National Park per year, a couple million acres of grassland and embedded temporary and seasonal wetland per year, still, despite all this conservation effort. And the hard part was riding it, the conditions were even worse than I thought. The data says this, but then to ride it was like, yeah, there was long stretches, in Saskatchewan or Kansas where, we couldn't find a healthy freshwater wetland or, a significant expanse of grassland. I mean, there was, sometimes 30 miles in a row where we wouldn't see any wetland or grassland, just crop field, and there's nothing wrong with crop field. It's good, that it's our breadbasket and such, an energy pump, as Mike says, the Great Plains is. But, we need to start thinking about what we leave behind before it's all gone.
Over the last several years, we've heard a lot about monarch butterflies and their migrations. I have not heard a lot about whooping cranes, and honestly, I don't think I've ever actually seen a whooping crane, and there's probably a reason for that, given how small their numbers are. But why whooping cranes, and why was that the focus? Why has that become such a focus for you guys?
Well, I'll take a swing at it first. Whooping cranes are the tallest birds in North America. They're also one of the rarest birds in the world. And there's 15 crane species in the world, and most of them are threatened and endangered. In North America, we have two crane species. We have the sandhill crane, which is the most populous that a lot of people in the Great Plains know about. They're gray, 3 to 4 feet tall. And then the whooping crane, the rarest. And, in the 1940s, they literally were down to less than 20 left in the entire world. And folks had written them off to extinction. And somehow, despite us and because of us, they have clawed and climbed their way back to roughly 550 or so in this Central Flyway population, which is the last remnant relic, true self-sustaining migratory population left in North America. And the thing about cranes is that cranes are they're long-lived creatures. They don't have chicks until they're adults, and it takes them 5 years to even get to adulthood. And then they only have 2 young a year, and then those chicks learn everything from mom and dad. It's not a lot of instinct. It's learning. And these birds can live to be 20, 30, 40 plus years in the wild together, and they're monogamous, and they are very human-like in their mannerisms, and cultures the world over that have related to cranes that go back. It's one of the oldest bird family species on the planet. They are a lot like us, and so they're very relatable. They're relatable like maybe a bear is, or a whale is, or an elephant is. But yeah, you're right, Sabrina. In plain sight, a lot of folks have never heard of this bird before. But their story in the Great Plains in North America on migration is very much our story too. I've spent a lot of time writing and photographing these birds and working on films with these birds, and being able to then do that with my buddy Andy, who's one of the great rock star ecologists out there today with these creatures. We felt like we had a good story to tell that could be relatable to people.
Mike said it really well, but it's not about the monarch either, right? The monarchs use about the same path, and the marbled godwits use about the same path, and the piping plovers use a similar path, and the LeConte sparrows use a similar path, and the list goes on and on. And this whole, this central flyway is like a ladder, right? And when you lose too many rungs, whether it's grassland or wetland for whatever species needs it, migration becomes harder, and in bad conditions, like in a drought, it can start to break down. And so, the whooping crane, it's one of a focal species I've studied for many years, and Mike has worked with for many years. So, I mean, that answers part of the why. But they were class of 1967, right? This is the first endangered species list before there was even a difference between endangered and threatened. The first version of the Endangered Species Act, which there was a couple more before we got to a final, they were on that list, and that was the class of 67, and they're still there, and a lot of that list, by virtue of being on that list, they've persisted, because of the policies and finances and awareness that goes into supporting a creature near extinction. The bald eagle was also on that list, and obviously fully recovered, but I think that's an interesting part of the story. So we want more people to know about the whooping crane. And we want more people to know that this path it follows is important to not just the whooping crane, but a whole diversity of things that use the central flyway in the Great Plains, and a whole ecosystem that's threatened. So we hope they're kind of an umbrella species, right? For getting people to care. There was a phrase on the Platte River where I worked for many years, and Mike's done a lot of work. Did the whooping crane save the Platte River, or did the Platte River save the whooping crane? Because it was actually a lot of work went in to the Platte River to make sure it continued to function to support the needs of migration for sandhills and whooping cranes and everything else. And I would argue that actually it was the whooping crane that brought the resources to save the river that's benefited so many other species. And we really need to kind of think like that for the whole flyway. If so why the whooping crane? There's too many answers to that, almost.
The way that ecology works together, and that kind of is what you were saying, how all of these different systems work together. It's not just the whooping crane, it's not just the monarch, it is every living being, including humans, in these areas. As pointed out earlier, there's a lot of ag involved in this route. There has to be, because we do need agriculture, of course. So it's a matter of finding balance. And that balance often can shift. And right now we've seen a shift to where there are different priorities that are not environmental priorities. Again, the Endangered Species Act has taken some hits. A lot of funding for programs conservation has taken in some hits. And that's because the priorities have shifted. So working with that and seeing how, conservation not being a priority anymore, losing the funding, not having a focus on maintaining wetlands, things like that, does this make your job harder? And what can people like me who are not necessarily involved in this but want to help, what can we do?
Yeah, if Mike, I'll take the stab first if
You
you don't
bet.
mind on this one. And the truth of the matter is there's a lot of affirmatives too. It's not just things are bad. So for instance, ranching, I'd say the fate of ranching is as tied to the fate of grassland conservation as any economic sector in the world, probably globally, right? And so sustainable ranching, I mean, as Mike has often said, it has to pay to stay, right? So how do we keep that grass and those wetlands on the ground? And in some ways, it just hasn't been properly credited for the economic things it's provided, right? It's not really as simple as humans versus the environment. In reality, it's thinking multi-generationally, it's thinking sustainably, and it's thinking economically as well. So, I mean, it's funny, that supporting working lands is a really important part of this from a policy perspective. If we paid ranchers for the environmental services their lands provided in terms of, filtering runoff and such like that, your ranching would be much more profitable. Similar with wetlands, right? So further south in the migration corridor, right, there's a lot of playas, and we've lost 85% of the playas in the southern plains. Well, those actually recharge groundwater, and that recharged groundwater in communities where we're actually scheduled to run out of groundwater, which is what's supporting our agriculture. So it's not actually as simple as humans versus nature, economy versus nature. Actually, it's actually we need a working economy that works for multiple generations and maintains these landscapes that add to quality of life for people, because hunting and ecological tourism bring in a lot of money too, so it can be very good for the economy. So I say that's not really an answer of what you can do as much as it is getting out of these really simplified binary kind of discussions or tropes on how this stuff works, because it's much more complicated. So heck, if you have land and you have a piece of property that's not productive, you're putting more inputs than you're getting outputs, it's probably a wetland. You could restore that. Actually, buying local beef or any bird-friendly beef or whatever, grass-fed beef, that's huge, because that's giving people a premium. And when we go through these economic hits recently, there's usually a policy to bail out farms, when grain prices get bad, but there's nothing to bail out those ranchers most of the time. So anyways, there's a lot you could do, and local policy matters, and local engagement in your community matters. Some of these communities have also suffered a lot on the Whooper Highway, because as farms have gotten bigger and ranching's disappeared, the number of people in the towns has dwindled, So anyways, being active in your local community and supporting local industry and tourism can actually be tied to supporting conservation if ecotourism and things play in.
Thank you, Andy. Now that is just the first part of our conversation. We continue with Andy and Mike in next week's Backstory, when we'll talk about specifically what they saw here in North Dakota. For the North Dakota News Cooperative, I'm Sabrina Halverson. This has been the Backstory.